8 in the morning. The Gulf of Oman. The USS Carl Vinson was carving a white wake through the blue water when the first ANSPY-6 radar contact flashed blood red on the tactical screens. The carrier strike group had been at modified battle stations for 6 hours, but the physics of the incoming threat had just changed. The air on the flight deck was thick with the smell of jet fuel and the low hum of cooling fans from the E-2 Charlie Hawkeye orbiting overhead. What was screaming down from the edge of space was not a cruise missile, but a ballistic trajectory that the strike group's defenses were never designed to stop alone. 40 miles to the north, an Iranian mobile launcher had fired a salvo of 4 Emad medium-range ballistic missiles. The missiles had reached an altitude of 150 kilometers before pitching over for their terminal phase. Traveling at 7 times the speed of sound, the warheads were now glowing white-hot as they re-entered the atmosphere. On the cruiser USS Lake Champlain, the Aegis combat system attempted to calculate a fire control solution for the Standard Missile 3 interceptors. 2 missiles leaped from the Mark 41 vertical launch system in a roar of white flame and chemical smoke. The interceptors climbed at a steep angle. There, rocket motors pushing them toward a point in space where the collision would occur in exactly 12 seconds. The crew in the Combat Direction Center watched the digitized symbols merge, their breath held in the recycled air of the darkened room. The first interceptor missed its target by less than 10 meters, the kinetic kill vehicle sailing harmlessly into the morning sky. The second interceptor detonated its proximity fuse, but the heavy casing of the Emad missile held together, its maneuverable re-entry vehicle shifting its flight path by 2 degrees. This small correction was enough to bypass the final layer of the carrier's outer defenses. On the flight deck of the USS Carl Vinson, the close-in weapon system mounts began to track, their 20mm Gatling guns spinning up to 6,000 rounds per minute. The sound was a mechanical scream that tore through the salt air. Tracer fire reached out like fingers of red light, seeking the incoming threat that was now only 3 seconds away. The first warhead struck the water 50 meters off the starboard bow, sending a tower of white spray 300 feet into the air. The second warhead did not miss. The 1,000-pound high-explosive warhead impacted the flight deck at a 45-degree angle, just aft of the number 2 elevator. The kinetic energy alone was enough to punch through 4 inches of hardened steel armor like it was wet paper. A millisecond later, the fuse triggered, and a fireball 200 feet wide erupted inside the upper hangar bay. The shockwave traveled through the massive hull of the 90,000-ton ship, throwing sailors off their feet and snapping heavy mooring lines like threads. On the bridge, the commanding officer felt the deck heave upward as the sound of the detonation reached him a low, visceral thud that vibrated through the very marrow of his bones. The USS Carl Vinson, a symbol of American power for 40 years, had just taken a mortal blow. Below decks, in the primary damage control station, the status boards lit up in a cascade of red warnings. Fire mains in the forward section had lost pressure instantly as the blast severed the main risers. Thick, oily black smoke began to pour from the ventilation ducts, carrying the acrid stench of burning hydraulic fluid and electrical insulation. The ship's list reached 3 degrees to port within 90 seconds as thousands of tons of seawater began to pour through the jagged hole in the hull. The damage control teams, dressed in heavy, fire-retardant suits, began to move toward the inferno, their boots clattering on the metal decks in the eerie green glow of the emergency lighting. The Gulf of Oman, usually a theater of quiet tension, had become a site of absolute chaos. Every sensor in the carrier strike group was now saturated with data. As the accompanying destroyers moved into a protective screen, there, radars searching for the second wave of missiles they knew was already in the air. The flight deck was a scene of wreckage. 2 FA-18 Super Hornets parked near the impact point had been reduced to shredded aluminum and burning titanium. Fuel from the ruptured aircraft began to flow across the non-skid surface, ignited by the primary blast. The ocean, once a calm blue mirror, was now being churned by the frantic maneuvers of the escort ships. The mission had shifted from power projection to a desperate fight for the lives of 5,000 men and women. As the carrier began its slow, agonizing lean into the sea, the world watched the first moments of a conflict that had no visible end. 8:05 in the morning. The lower decks of the USS Carl Vinson. The primary impact of the second Emad missile had occurred just above the waterline, where the kinetic energy of the warhead bypassed the heavy belt armor designed to protect the carrier from conventional torpedoes. The explosion tore a jagged hole 25 feet wide into the 4th and 5th decks, instantly vaporizing the fuel lines and high-voltage electrical conduits serving the forward propulsion systems. Thousands of tons of pressurized seawater surged into the void, overwhelming the automatic bilge pumps within the first 45 seconds of the breach. The ship shuddered with a deep, metallic groan that echoed through the entire 5,000-man hull as the internal bulkheads began to buckle under the immense weight of the incoming ocean. Damage Control Central, located deep within the armored citadel of the ship, was a scene of controlled desperation. The damage control officer stood before a digital status board that was rapidly turning red, indicating that 3 major watertight compartments had already been lost to the sea. The list of the ship had increased from 3 degrees to 7 degrees in less than 5 minutes, a rate of flooding that signaled a catastrophic failure of the primary longitudinal bulkheads. In the narrow passageways of Deck 6, sailors struggled against a waist-deep torrent of oily water that carried the sharp, stinging smell of diesel fuel and raw sewage. They were equipped with self-contained breathing apparatuses and carried portable Pone-100 pumps, but the volume of the incoming water was far beyond the capacity of their equipment. The sound below the waterline was a deafening roar of rushing water punctuated by the sharp, gunshot-like cracks of structural steel snapping under tension. The emergency lighting flickered and died in the forward engineering spaces, leaving the damage control teams to work by the narrow beams of their tactical flashlights. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and burning rubber as the main electrical bus bars shorted out, sending cascades of blue sparks into the flooded compartments. On the bridge, the commanding officer watched the inclinometer with grim focus as the needle drifted steadily toward the 10-degree mark. At 10 degrees, the carrier would reach a point of instability where the flight deck could no longer support the weight of the parked aircraft, potentially leading to a secondary disaster of sliding wreckage. 5 decks above the flooding, the hangar bay was a landscape of smoke and twisted metal. The explosion from the flight deck had punched downward, sending shrapnel and white-hot fire into the maintenance shops where dozens of sailors had been working on aircraft engines. The fire suppression system, designed to flood the hangar with high-expansion foam, had been severed by the initial blast, leaving the crews to fight the growing inferno with handheld extinguishers. The heat was so intense that the aluminum skin of a nearby FA-18 Super Hornet began to melt, dripping like liquid silver onto the deck. The sailors moved with practiced discipline, dragging wounded comrades away from the heat even as the floor beneath them began to tilt at an increasingly dangerous angle. The technical reality of the situation was becoming clear to the strike group commander aboard the cruiser USS Lake Champlain. The USS Carl Vinson was taking on water at a rate of approximately 15,000 tons per hour, far exceeding the ship's ability to counter-flood or pump out. The engineering teams attempted to shift fuel and ballast water to the starboard tanks to offset the list, but the cross-deck transfer pumps failed as the primary power grid collapsed. The massive carrier, once the centerpiece of American naval power in the Indian Ocean, was now a 90,000-ton casualty of a weapon system it had not been able to intercept. Every minute that passed saw the water rise another 6 inches in the forward machinery rooms, claiming critical systems and plunging the ship further into darkness. The environment around the ship was equally hostile, with the Gulf air reaching a temperature of 95 degrees as the morning sun climbed higher. The sea was relatively calm, but the surface was already beginning to shimmer with a rainbow-colored film of leaked JP-5 aviation fuel. The smell of the sea was gone, replaced entirely by the chemical stench of a dying warship and the acrid smoke of a fire that would not go out. On the flight deck, the wind was picking up, whipping the black smoke from the hangar bay across the remaining aircraft like a funeral shroud. The question was no longer whether the ship could be saved, but how many of the 5,000 souls on board could be extracted before the sea claimed the flight deck. The communication lines between the carrier and the rest of the strike group remained open only through high-frequency backup radios. The executive officer reported that the forward engine room was now fully submerged and that the forward auxiliary machinery room was expected to fail within 10 minutes. The list had reached 9 degrees, and the sounds of unrestrained equipment crashing into bulkheads began to rise from the lower storage decks. The USS Carl Vinson was dying from the inside out, its structural integrity failing as the weight of the water crushed the very bones of the ship. In the distance, the first rescue helicopters from the accompanying destroyers were already lifting off, their pilots squinting through the haze at the massive, listing target that was their home. 8:07 in the morning, Al Udeid Air Base, Qatar. The Combat Operations Center at Central Command was already a hive of activity when the first flash message from the USS Carl Vinson reached the duty terminal. The message was short, encoded in high-priority bursts that bypassed the standard communication queues to reach the highest levels of the United States military. It confirmed the worst-case scenario: a successful ballistic missile strike on a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier in international waters. The air in the underground bunker was cool and smelled of ozone, a sharp contrast to the humid, oil-choked chaos currently unfolding 500 miles to the east. On the main theater display, a 60-foot-wide digital map of the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea pulsed with real-time data from a dozen sources. A KH-11 reconnaissance satellite had been repositioned within 3 minutes of the initial launch detection, and the high-resolution imagery was now being processed by intelligence officers. The live feed showed a jagged black scar across the flight deck of the USS Carl Vinson, and a plume of thick smoke that stretched for 20 miles toward the coast of Oman. The tactical officer reported the carrier's exact position at coordinates 24 degrees, 12 minutes north, 58 degrees, 30 minutes east. The ship was effectively dead in the water. Its speed dropped to 0 knots, and the thermal signature indicated massive internal fires burning near the primary reactor shielding. The commanding general of Central Command authorized the immediate activation of the Red Line protocols, a set of pre-planned responses for a direct attack on United States sovereignty. This directive removed the standard restrictions on engagement for all United States Navy and Air Force assets currently operating in the Indo-Pacific Command Area of Responsibility. Within seconds, encrypted orders were transmitted via the Milstar satellite constellation to the USS Gerald R. Ford, currently located 300 miles to the south. The order was for the carrier to bring its entire air wing to immediate launch readiness and to establish a combat air patrol over the stricken Vinson. The objective was to create a defensive bubble of steel and radar to protect the survivors from a follow-up attack. The command staff began the systematic process of coordinating a multi-theater response involving hundreds of aircraft and dozens of surface vessels. Orders were sent to the 48th Fighter Wing in the United Kingdom and land-based F-15E Strike Eagles in the United Arab Emirates to prepare for suppression of enemy air defense missions. The logistics officers calculated the response times for the specialized medical evacuation flights and the arrival of the nearest heavy-lift salvage tugs from the port of Duqm. They knew the window for saving the ship was closing, but the primary focus shifted to the 5,000 personnel currently trapped on the listing Steel Island. The political implications of the strike were pushed aside as the machinery of the United States military moved with the mechanical precision of a clock. 12,000 tons of aviation fuel and 3,000 tons of ordnance were still stored in the carrier's magazines, making every second a gamble against a secondary explosion. The damage control reports, coming through the link, indicated that the forward engineering spaces were fully submerged and the list was now exceeding 10 degrees. At Central Command, the decision was made to prepare for the total loss of the vessel while maximizing the survival rate of the crew through an unprecedented rescue operation. The United States was now in a state of undeclared war, and the response would be measured in the weight of the ordnance delivered and the speed of the incoming fleet. The morning sun was high over the Gulf, but for the leadership in Qatar, the world was defined by the red icons moving across a digital screen. 8:20 in the morning, the flight deck of the USS Carl Vinson. The world had become a tilted plain of gray steel, black smoke, and screaming wind. The list to port had reached exactly 10 degrees, and every sailor on the roof was fighting a constant, invisible force pulling them toward the edge of the ship and the churning wake 100 feet below. The air was a toxic mix of salt spray and the thick, oily stench of burning JP-5 aviation fuel rising from the jagged hole near the number 2 elevator. The mission for the flight deck crew was now a desperate race against physics. If the list reached 12 degrees, the safety interlocks on the plan, steam catapults would automatically engage, rendering the ship's remaining offensive power useless. 3. FA-18 Super Hornets from Strike Fighter Squadron 147 were lined up near catapult number 1, the only launcher still receiving sufficient steam pressure from the undamaged sections of the engineering plant. The aircraft handlers, known as the Yellow Shirts, moved with a frantic but disciplined urgency, their boots slipping on the non-skid surface that was now coated in a fine mist of hydraulic fluid and sea spray. They were attempting to launch the Alert Mest 5 aircraft jets that had been fueled and armed with AIM-120 advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles and AGM-88 HARM missiles. These fighters were the carrier's last contribution to the defensive bubble that was being coordinated by the cruiser USS Lake Champlain. The lead pilot, a lieutenant commander with 12 years of carrier experience, sat in the cockpit of a 66,000-pound machine that was currently straining against its deck tie-downs. Through the canopy, he could see the horizon was no longer a flat line, but a diagonal slash across his field of vision. He watched the catapult officer, who was braced against the tilt, signaling in for engine start. The twin engines of the FA-18 ignited with a visceral roar that vibrated through the steel deck and into the soles of the crew's feet. White steam began to leak from the catapult track, swirling in the wind and mixing with the black smoke from the hangar. Fires. The pressure in the catapult cylinders was holding at 450 pounds per square inch, just enough for a maximum weight launch. The catapult officer gave the signal to wrap it up, and the pilot pushed the throttles into full afterburner. 2 columns of blue-white flame erupted. From the back of the jet, the heat haze distorting the view of the escort destroyers 4 miles away. With a final salute, the pilot braced, his head against the seat. The catapult fired with a sound like a thunderclap, the shuttle dragging the aircraft from 0 to 250 kilometers per hour in less than 3 seconds. The jet dipped momentarily as it left the deck, the pilot struggling to compensate for the Somni, uneven launch caused by the ship's list before the wings caught the air and the fighter climbed steeply into the morning sky. It was the last successful launch from the USS Carl Vinson. As the second aircraft was being moved into position, a massive shudder ran through the ship. Deep below the waterline, a secondary bulkhead in the forward machinery room finally gave way under the pressure of 15,000 tons of seawater. The list increased from 10 degrees to 11.5 degrees in a matter of seconds. The 66,000-pound Super Hornet on the catapult began to slide sideways, its nose gear twisting under the lateral stress. The flight deck officer screamed the abort signal over the radio net, but the damage was already done. The aircraft's wingtips struck a parked forklift, shearing off the missile rail and sending a shower of sparks across the fuel-soaked deck. The crew on the flight deck realized then that the battle to maintain flight operations was over. The deck angle was now too steep for the tugs to move the remaining aircraft safely, and the steam pressure from the reactors began to drop as the engineering teams were forced to abandon the remaining auxiliary spaces. The commanding officer issued the order to secure the deck, a command that meant the remaining 15 aircraft on the roof would be abandoned where they sat. The sailors began to retreat toward the island structure, their eyes stinging from the smoke, and their faces flushed with the heat of the uncontrolled fires. The environment was now one of surreal stillness, punctuated by disaster. The carrier was moving. At less than 2 knots, its massive hull acting as a windbreak for the whitecaps of the Gulf. The smell of the sea was entirely gone, replaced by the smell of a dying machine, melted rubber, scorched paint, and the ozone of short-circuited electronics. Above the lone FA-18 that had successfully launched banked hard to the west. Its pilot, looking down at the massive, smoking silhouette of his home. The USS Carl Vinson. Platform of power. It was a listing, burning island of steel, and the 5,000 people on board were now facing the reality of a ship that would soon belong to the ocean. 8:35 in the morning. The defensive screen, 5 miles east of the listing carrier. The destroyer, USS Mason, turned hard to starboard, its AN/SPY-1 Delta radar painting, dozens of high-speed contacts emerging from the coastal haze. The Gulf air was heavy, smelling of salt and the distant, acrid smoke of the Vinson's fires, but here, the atmosphere was charged with the static of high-powered electronics and the tension of imminent combat. This was the second wave, a coordinated swarm of Iranian fast attack craft and land-based cruise missiles intended to finish what the Emad ballistic missiles had started. The destroyer was the center of the Iron Wall, a 3-ship screen positioned to intercept anything that dared to approach the wounded carrier. The tactical officer on the USS Mason gave the command, "Weapons free." A rolling airframe missile shrieked from its launcher on the aft deck, a white column of fire punching backward through the salt spray. The heat blast washed across the faces of the sailors standing near the interior hatches, and the chemical bite of the propellant filled the air. The missile accelerated to twice the speed of sound in seconds, its infrared seeker, locking onto the heat signature of an incoming Iranian Qatar cruise missile that was skimming just 10 meters above the waves. The warhead intercepted the incoming cruise missile 3 miles out, the kinetic energy and high explosive blast vaporizing the enemy weapon instantly. A fireball 200 feet wide bleached the morning sky white, sending a rain of burning magnesium and aluminum fragments into the sea. The shock wave from the detonation skipped across the surface of the water, hitting the hull of the Mason with a dull, metallic thud. Immediately, the destroyer's 5-inch gun turret swiveled to the north, its automated loading system cycling 70-pound shells into the breach with a mechanical rhythm. The lead Iranian fast boat, a catamaran-hulled vessel, traveling at 45 knots, attempted a high-speed turn to evade the incoming fire. But the Mason's radar-directed gun had already calculated the solution. The 5-inch shell punched straight through the fiberglass hull of the boat, detonating the onboard fuel cell and 2 anti-ship missiles still on their racks. The vessel erupted in a single, massive orange flash. The turret lifted straight off the hull, 6 tons of composite material rising 4 meters before it fell back and vanished into the churned water. The remaining boats in the formation scattered in panic, their wake patterns crisscrossing as they tried to break the Mason's lock. Black smoke rose from the patches of burning oil where the fast boats had been destroyed. The radio channels of the enemy formation erupted, in overlapping voices, each one louder than the last, as the discipline of the swarm collapsed under the precision of the American response. The deck of the Mason was still shuddering from the recoil of the main gun, and the smell of burnt powder was thick on the bridge. The iron wall had held for the moment, but the tactical display showed a third group of contacts forming near the Iranian coast, at coordinates 25 degrees north, 59 degrees east. The USS Mason and its sister ship, the USS Halsey, began a coordinated shift in position to widen the defensive perimeter. The close-in weapon system mounts on both ships remained in automatic mode, their radar dishes searching the horizon for any low-flying threats that had bypassed the outer layer of missiles. The sailors in the Combat Direction Center worked with professional silence, their hands moving over touchscreens to assign targets and monitor the health of the Aegis system. The technical superiority of the United States Navy was being tested in a high-density environment, and every intercepted missile was a victory bought with seconds of reaction time. The heat of the morning was becoming oppressive, reaching 98 degrees, but the crews inside the air-conditioned destroyers were focused entirely on the digital world of the radar screens. The Gulf of Oman was no longer a waterway. It was a kill zone. Behind them, the USS Carl Vinson continued to list, a massive silhouette against the sun, while the destroyers stood like sentinels between the dying carrier and the shore. The Iron Wall was not just a tactic. It was the only thing keeping 5,000 American sailors from being targeted again, as they prepared for the most dangerous phase of the morning, the total evacuation of the ship. 8:45 in the morning. The Gulf of Oman. The order that every sailor in the United States Navy trains for, but prays never to hear, finally crackled over the ship's general announcing system. Abandon ship. Abandon ship. All hands, make your way to your designated life raft stations. This is not a drill. The voice of the executive officer was steady, but it competed with the shrieking groan of twisting structural steel and the roar of uncontrolled fires still raging in the forward hangar bay. The USS Carl Vinson was now listing 12.5 degrees to port, a critical angle where the massive weight of the island structure and the remaining aircraft began to pull the center of gravity toward a point of no return. The air was a thick, yellow haze of smoke and evaporated seawater, tasting of copper and salt. Under the blistering morning sun, which had now pushed the temperature on the steel deck to over 100 degrees, thousands of sailors lined up at the edge of the ship. They were wearing orange life vests and carrying their emergency breathing canisters, their faces blackened by soot but their movements precise. The abandoned ship protocol was a masterpiece of logistics born of disaster. The crew did not jump, but lowered themselves down long, ribbed evacuation chutes, or boarded the inflatable life rafts that had been launched from the starboard side. Each raft, a bright orange circle against the dark, oil-slicked water, was designed to hold 25 personnel and was equipped with enough supplies for 5 days at sea. Below the flight deck, the situation was far more perilous. In the darkened passageways of the third and fourth decks, damage control teams acted as marshals, using chemical light sticks to guide their shipmates through the rising water. The smell was a nauseating mixture of raw sewage, hydraulic fluid, and the metallic tang of blood from the wounded who were being carried on stretchers. The walking wounded were prioritized first, supported by their comrades as they climbed the vertical ladders that were now tilted at a disorienting angle. Every few minutes, the ship would give a sickening lurch, the sound of internal bulkheads collapsing, echoing like heavy artillery fire through the hull. The 5,000 men and women on board were not just fighting for their lives, they were fighting the clock against a 90,000-ton machine that was rapidly becoming a coffin. 6 MH-60 Sierra helicopters from the accompanying destroyers hovered 500 yards off the starboard beam, their rotors kicking up a constant spray of salt water that shimmered in the light. The pilots were performing a delicate aerial dance, moving in one by one to hoist the critically injured directly from the flight deck. The downdraft from the heavy rotors momentarily cleared the black smoke, providing a few seconds of breathable air for the deck crews. The rescue swimmers, lowered on steel cables, moved with frantic speed to secure the litters. Their bright green flight suits a sharp contrast to the black oil, spreading across the surface of the Gulf. Each helicopter could carry only a dozen at a time, making the process a grueling, repetitive cycle of hope and exhaustion. The environment around the carrier had transformed into a graveyard of technology. Life rafts bobbed in the shadow of the massive hull, while millions of dollars of sensitive electronics and survival gear floated in the growing debris field. The water was no longer blue, it was a dark, viscous gray, coated in the rainbow sheen of 30,000 gallons of leaked aviation fuel. The heat radiating from the burning hangar bay was so intense that sailors on the life rafts had to use their oars to push away from the hull to avoid having the rubber melted beneath them. The sound of the sea, usually a rhythmic pulse, was drowned out by the hiss of fire hitting water and the distant, muffled thuds of secondary explosions deep within the ship's magazines. At 9 in the morning, the commanding officer of the USS Carl Vinson made his final sweep of the bridge. He looked at the empty consoles and the shattered windows, the coordinates of 24 degrees 12 minutes north still glowing on a backup display. He was the last to leave the nerve center of the ship, carrying only the ship's log and the heavy burden of the loss. As he stepped onto the flight deck, he saw the final group of sailors sliding down the chutes into the waiting rafts. The ship was now silent, except for the wind and the fire. the pride of the Third Fleet, a vessel that had projected American power across the globe for 4 decades, was now a hollowed-out shell, its decks abandoned to the encroaching ocean. In the distance, the destroyer DDG-51 and the cruiser CG-73 moved in closer, their crews lining the rails to watch the evacuation. They were there to provide cover, their sensors still scanning the horizon for the next Iranian move, but their primary mission was now one of mercy. The rescue was a massive, decentralized operation, with commercial tankers in the area being directed by the United States Coast Guard to assist in picking up the drifting rafts. The sun continued its slow climb, indifferent to the catastrophe below. The evacuation of 5,000 people in under an hour was a feat of training and courage, but as the last raft pulled away, a heavy, somber silence fell over the water. The Vinson was alone now, its long shadow stretching across the Gulf like a final salute. 9 in the morning. Al Udeid Air Base, Qatar. 4:15 Echo Strike Eagles were already screaming down the runway, their twin engines shaking the desert floor and sending plumes of shimmering heat into the pale blue sky. The roar of the afterburners was a physical weight, a sound that carried the fury of a superpower that had just seen its crown jewel struck in an open sea. This was not a routine patrol or a show of force. It was the lead element of a coordinated retaliatory strike, aimed at decapitating the long-range missile capabilities that had crippled the USS Carl Vinson. The air at the edge of the runway was 110 degrees, smelling of sun-baked asphalt and the sharp chemical bite of burned JP-8 fuel. The Strike Eagles were heavily laden, each carrying a payload of 16 GBU-39 small-diameter bombs and 2 AGM-88 HARM missiles for the suppression of enemy air defenses. As they climbed to 30,000 feet, they were joined by a pair of EA-18 Golf Growlers from a land-based expeditionary squadron, aircraft designed to blind the Iranian radar network with a wall of electronic noise. The pilots moved with a cold, mechanical focus, their voices over the encrypted radio nets sparse and professional. The mission was clear: locate and destroy the mobile Emad missile batteries located along the rugged coastline of the Hormozgan province. To the east, the Persian Gulf was a vast mirror reflecting the morning sun, but as the formation crossed the coastline at Mach 1.2, the landscape shifted to the jagged, brown mountains of Iran. The environment here was hostile and vertical, providing a dozen places for a mobile launcher to hide within the deep shadows of the canyons. The flight lead checked his tactical display, which was being fed real-time targeting data from an E-3 Sentry orbiting over the Arabian Sea. The coordinates were locked: 26 degrees 40 minutes north, 57 degrees 15 minutes east. A satellite had spotted the thermal bloom of the launchers, retreating into a hardened tunnel complex 5 miles inland from the coast. The Iranian defense network came alive as the American jets crossed the border. An HQ-9 surface-to-air missile battery, located on a ridge overlooking the Strait of Hormuz, began to radiate, its fire control radar locking onto the lead Strike Eagle. Inside the cockpit, the pilot's warning receiver erupted in a rhythmic chirping, a sound that signaled he was being painted by a lethal threat. The pilot did not flinch. He waited for the electronic warfare officer in the back seat to confirm the lock. Magnum. Magnum, the backseater called out, and an AGM-88 HARM missile detached from the wing, its rocket motor igniting with a white-hot flash. The missile dived toward the radar source at 3 times the speed of sound, seeking the electronic pulse like a shark sensing blood in the water. The HARM missile struck the radar van of the HQ-9 battery with pinpoint accuracy. The high-explosive warhead punched through the thin skin of the vehicle, detonating inside the electronic suite and sending a pillar of black smoke and twisted metal into the mountain air. With the primary radar blinded, the Strike Eagles moved into their bombing run. The flight lead activated the Lantern targeting pod, the infrared camera cutting through the morning haze to reveal the entrance of the missile tunnels. 3 mobile launchers, massive 10-wheeled vehicles carrying the long, white cylinders of the Emad missiles, were visible in the mouth of the cave. "Weapons away," the lead pilot said. 8 small-diameter bombs detached from the belly of the 15 Echo, their wings deploying as they glided toward the target on a GPS-guided path. The bombs arrived in a staggered sequence, designed to collapse the tunnel entrance before destroying the vehicles inside. The first 4 bombs struck the overhang of the canyon, dropping thousands of tons of rock and debris directly onto the path of the retreating launchers. The remaining 4 bombs punched through the dust cloud, detonating against the fuel tanks of the lead vehicle. A secondary explosion followed almost instantly, a massive, white-hot eruption of missile propellant that sent a pressure wave rolling down the canyon floor, shattering the windows of a nearby observation post. The Strike Eagles banked hard to the west, their sensors confirming the total destruction of the battery. The mission had taken less than 12 minutes from the moment they crossed the coast. Below them, the Iranian mountains were scarred by the black smudge of the strike, the silence of the desert replaced by the fading thunder of American engines. The pilots checked their fuel gauges and prepared for an aerial refueling from a KC-135 tanker orbiting over the Gulf of Oman. The retaliation had begun, and the message was being delivered in the language of precision-guided ordnance. As the jets flew back toward the sea, they passed over the debris field where the USS Carl Vinson was still visible on the horizon, a dark shape surrounded by the white dots of rescue rafts. The contrast was a stark reminder of the cost of the morning's engagement. The United States military was now fully committed to a high-intensity campaign of systematic destruction, targeting every Iranian asset capable of reaching the rescue fleet. The air was no longer still. It was filled with the sounds of a superpower at war, and the first wave of retaliation was only the beginning of a long, dark day. 9:45 in the morning. The Gulf of Oman. The United States Navy destroyer USS Mason had become the makeshift command center for the largest search and rescue operation since the Second World War. 5,422 personnel from the USS Carl Vinson were currently scattered across 10 square kilometers of open ocean, drifting in orange life rafts or clinging to debris in a sea coated with a thick, toxic layer of aviation fuel. The air was a suffocating 105 degrees, shimmering with heat that distorted the horizon and made the task of spotting individual survivors nearly impossible for the naked eye. The smell of the sea had been completely replaced by the chemical stench of JP-5 fuel and the iron tang of blood from the hundreds of wounded being pulled from the water. The logistics of survival were being calculated in real time by a team of 20 specialists in the destroyer's Combat Information Center. Every available helicopter in the strike group, a total of 12 MH-60 Sierra helicopters and 4 MH-60 Romeo helicopters, was pushed into a continuous flight rotation. Each aircraft was flying until its fuel state reached the absolute minimum required to return to a deck, landing only long enough to offload casualties and take on more fuel before lifting off again. The flight crews were operating on pure adrenaline, their flight suits soaked in sweat as they performed hover hoists in the turbulent air created by the heat rising from the burning carrier. By 10 in the morning, these helicopters had completed 140 sorties, moving 385 critically injured sailors to the primary triage centers. Because the nearest dedicated hospital ship was still 4 days away, the strike group commander designated the motor tanker Pacific Pearl, a commercial crude carrier located 12 miles away, as the primary casualty receiving station. Under the authority of international maritime law and emergency military requisition, the tanker was ordered to a dead stop at coordinates 24 degrees, 15 minutes north, 58 degrees, 40 minutes east. 4 surgical teams from the USS Carl Vinson, who had been among the first evacuated, were winched onto the tanker's massive flat deck, along with 2,000 pounds of medical supplies. Within an hour, the tanker's crew had cleared the midship section to create a makeshift ward capable of holding 500 patients. They used heavy-duty industrial fans to circulate air, set up hundreds of liters of intravenous fluids, and 400 units of O-negative blood that had been flown in by fast-response transport aircraft from Al Udeid. The distribution of water and basic medical care to the 482 life rafts was a secondary logistical nightmare. Small boats, from the escorting destroyers, the USS Mason and the USS Halsey, moved through the debris field like water taxis, tossing crates of bottled water and emergency rations into the rafts. Each raft was assigned a unique digital tracking number in the Mason's tactical database to ensure no group was missed. In the chaos, the logistics officers had to account for the fact that the surface current was moving the survivors at a rate of 2 knots, toward the northeast, toward the very coast where the Iranian batteries were still active. This required the destroyers to constantly reposition their hulls to act as physical shields against both the sun and any potential incoming fire. The human cost was beginning to be quantified in precise, agonizing numbers. The initial casualty report, transmitted to the Pentagon via encrypted satellite link, listed 112 personnel confirmed killed in action, most of whom had been in the forward engineering spaces or the hangar bay at the moment of impact. 342 sailors were listed as missing, likely trapped deep within the flooded compartments of the carrier. Over 800 were being treated for various degrees of thermal burns, shrapnel, wounds, and respiratory distress from smoke inhalation. Despite the horrific numbers, the survival rate for those who made it to the rafts was holding at 99%, a testament to the rigorous training and the speed of the logistical response. Fuel logistics for the rescue fleet itself became a critical concern as the morning progressed. The destroyers were burning fuel at 3 times their normal rate to maintain high-speed maneuvering and power. Their high-output radar systems, a Henry J. Kaiser-class replenishment oiler, the USNS Joshua Humphreys, was vectored to the scene at flank speed, carrying 180,000 barrels of fuel and enough refrigerated food to sustain the rescue force for 30 days. The underway replenishment process, which normally took hours of careful station keeping, was executed with a desperate efficiency, the fuel lines stretching between the ships like umbilical cords of survival in the middle of a war zone. As the sun reached its zenith, the environment became a test of endurance for every person in the water. The oil slick acted as a heat trap, raising the water temperature near the surface to 90 degrees. Sailors in the rafts used their shirts to cover their heads, their skin blistered by the combination of salt and intense ultraviolet radiation. The silence of the open ocean was broken only by the constant, rhythmic thrum of helicopter blades and the distant, muffled booms of the USS Carl Vinson's internal bulkheads finally collapsing. The logistics of survival were working, but the window of safety was narrow. The United States Navy was pouring every resource it possessed into this patch of the Gulf, turning a site of catastrophe into a monumental effort of human preservation. 10 in the morning. The dark, pressurized silence of the Strait of Hormuz. The Virginia-class nuclear-powered attack submarine, USS New Hampshire, was gliding at a depth of 150 meters, its sonar arrays listening to the chaotic acoustic signature of the surface world above. Beside the high-yield steel hull was cold and black, a stark contrast to the burning heat and sun-bleached wreckage 500 miles to the south. Inside the control room, the air was cool and scrubbed clean, carrying the faint, metallic scent of amine and the low, steady hum of the nuclear reactor's cooling pumps. The crew moved with the quiet efficiency of ghosts, their faces illuminated by the soft blue and red glow of the multifunction workstations. The submarine had been operating in a state of ultra-quiet patrol for 72 hours, but the mission changed the moment a very low-frequency signal reached the towed array antenna. The message, encoded in high-priority flash bursts, contained a Strike Package Alpha authorization. The USS New Hampshire was ordered to neutralize a cluster of Iranian coastal defense cruise missile sites located on the cliffs overlooking the narrowest point of the strait. These batteries, equipped with Noor and Qatar anti-ship missiles, posed a direct threat to the rescue fleet and the incoming carrier strike group. The commanding officer surveyed the digital chart, marking the targets at coordinates 26 degrees, 33 minutes north, 56 degrees, 18 minutes east. The order was given to bring the ship to a depth of 20 meters for a vertical launch. The ballast tanks hissed as air displaced water, and the massive 7,800-ton Predator tilted upward. In the Virginia payload module, 12 Tomahawk Block 5 cruise missiles sat ready in their vertical launch tubes. Each missile was a 1,600-pound precision instrument of destruction, programmed with a GPS-guided flight path that would take it over the rugged Iranian coastline at an altitude of only 50 feet. The weapons officer confirmed the targeting solutions, the digital interlocks clicking into a green status across the board. The fire button was depressed. A muffled, heavy thump echoed through the pressure hull as the first Mark 45 vertical launch system tube opened. A high-pressure gas generator ignited, ejecting the Tomahawk cruise missile from the submarine in a massive bubble of air. The missile breached the surface of the Gulf, its solid-fuel rocket booster igniting with a roar that was swallowed by the vastness of the sea. A white column of fire punched upward, the heat momentarily boiling the surrounding water into a cloud of steam. 3 seconds later, the missile's wings deployed, and the small turbofan engine kicked in with a high-pitched whine, pushing the weapon into a low-altitude sprint toward the shore. The first warhead slammed into the primary command and control van of the coastal battery with a terminal velocity of 800 kilometers per hour. The 1,000-pound high-explosive warhead punched straight through the reinforced roof of the mobile unit before detonating. The vehicle was obliterated instantly, the blast wave shredding the nearby camouflage netting and sending fragments of sensitive radar electronics flying across the rocky ridge. The fire from the explosion was so intense, it ignited the fuel tanks of 2 neighboring missile transporters, creating a secondary eruption that sent a column of black smoke 300 meters into the air. The defensive crews on the ridge scattered in total panic, their boots slipping on the loose gravel as they tried to reach the safety of the nearby bunkers. But the Tomahawks were arriving in a timed sequence, spaced exactly 15 seconds apart. The second missile impacted a cluster of 4 ready-to-fire Cater missiles still on their racks. The resulting detonation was catastrophic. The Iranian missiles cooked off in their canisters, their rocket motors igniting and sending the unguided weapons spiraling into the cliffs. A pillar of orange fire and white chemical smoke rose from the ridge, visible to commercial ships 40 miles out at sea. The coastal defense site, which only minutes ago had been a lethal threat to the United States Navy, was reduced to a landscape of burning tires and twisted steel. Inside the USS New Hampshire, the sonar supervisor reported the acoustic signatures of the shore-based explosions. The commanding officer ordered the ship back to a depth of 200 meters. The submarine diving once more into the cold, protective layers of the deep. The mission was a surgical success. 12 missiles launched, 12 targets destroyed, with 0 casualties to American personnel. The submarine vanished from the tactical picture of the enemy, leaving behind only the wreckage on the cliffs and the fading sound of its propellers in the water. The environment of the Strait of Hormuz remained tense, but the immediate threat of a shore-based missile strike had been systematically dismantled. The Hunter in the deep had done its job, proving that even a nuclear carrier's loss would not leave the United States without a terrifying reach. As the New Hampshire moved back toward the open waters of the Arabian Sea, the crew began the process of reloading the digital launch protocols for the next phase of the campaign. The war was not over, but the gateway to the Gulf was now a little wider, bought with the precision of a silent strike from the dark. 11 in the morning. The North Arabian Sea. The USS Gerald R. Ford was surging through a 3-meter swell at 30 knots, its 4 massive bronze propellers pushing 100,000 tons of steel toward the conflict zone. The carrier had been running at flank speed for 6 hours, closing the gap between its previous station and the wreckage of the USS Carl Vinson. The air on the 4.5-acre flight deck was a shimmering haze of heat and salt spray, smelling of high-octane aviation fuel and the ozone of the world's most advanced electromagnetic catapults. This was the arrival of the most powerful warship ever built. A floating fortress designed to dominate the electromagnetic spectrum and the sky simultaneously. In the Combat Direction Center, located deep within the armored island of the ship, the atmosphere was one of silent, high-tech intensity. The AN/SPY-6 radar system was active, its dual-band arrays emitting powerful pulses that could track an object the size of a golf ball from hundreds of miles away. The tactical display showed a 300-mile radius around the carrier, a digital bubble of absolute surveillance. The commanding officer of the Gerald R. Ford issued the order to establish a total exclusion zone centered at coordinates 17 degrees 45 minutes north, 62 degrees 10 minutes east. Any aircraft, manned or unmanned, that entered this 500-mile circle without a United States military transponder would be identified as a hostile target and engaged without further warning. The Electromagnetic Aircraft Launch System, or EMALS, hummed with a low-frequency vibration as the first F-35 Charlie Lightning II stealth fighter was moved into position on catapult number 1. Unlike the steam catapults of the older carriers, this system used a pulse of raw electricity to accelerate the 30-ton aircraft. The catapult officer gave the signal, and the jet was hurled forward with a silent, terrifying force, reaching 260 kilometers per hour in under 3 seconds. Within 15 minutes, the Gerald R. Ford had launched a full deck load of 24 aircraft, including 12 F-35 Charlies, 8 FA-18 Golf Growlers for electronic warfare, and 4 E-2 Delta Advanced Hawkeyes to act as the eyes of the fleet. The F-35 Charlies climbed to 40,000 feet, their stealth coatings making them invisible to the Iranian coastal radars. They were armed with the AIM-120 Delta, a missile capable of striking a target from over 160 kilometers away. The pilots used their helmet-mounted displays to see through the floor of their cockpits. Their sensors fused into a single, coherent picture of the battlefield. They established a continuous combat air patrol over the rescue fleet, their presence creating an invisible ceiling that no Iranian fighter dared to test. The Growlers accompanied them, flooding the airwaves with digital noise that effectively blinded the remaining Iranian long-range sensors along the coast. The technical superiority of the Gerald R. Ford allowed it to function as a massive vacuum for data. Every radio transmission, every radar pulse, and every thermal signature within the Gulf of Oman was captured, analyzed by artificial intelligence, and redistributed to the escort destroyers. The carrier strike group was now a single, integrated weapon system. The destroyer USS Mason, still processing the survivors of the Vinson, received a dedicated data link that allowed it to see targets far beyond its own horizon. The environment was no longer one of chaos and uncertainty. The arrival of the second carrier had imposed a rigid, American-controlled order onto the theater of war. The heat of the day reached 108 degrees, the sun, a white disk in a bleached sky, but the operations on the Gerald R. Ford continued with mechanical perfection. The deck crews, wearing color-coded jerseys, moved with the synchronized grace of a professional team, refueling and rearming aircraft in record time. The ship's 3 elevators moved thousands of pounds of ordnance, from the magazines to the roof, every minute. The message being sent to the world was clear. The United States Navy could lose a carrier and, within 3 hours, replace it with a more lethal, more advanced version of the same power. By 12 noon, the no-fly zone was fully operational. 2 Iranian 4 Phantom jets that had attempted to take off from a base near Chabahar were immediately painted by the F-35 radars. The American pilots did not break radio silence. They simply executed a head-on intercept at Mach 1.5. The Iranian pilots, seeing their own warning systems erupt in a lethal lock-on tone from an invisible enemy, broke formation and dived back toward their airfield. The sky belonged to the Gerald R. Ford. The rescue of the Vinson survivors could now continue under the protection of a shield that could not be broken. 8 in the evening on the 12th of January, 2026. 50,000 feet above the dark expanse of the Arabian Sea. The 2 B-2 Spirit bombers had been in the air for 22 hours, having flown a non-stop mission from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. Inside the cockpit, the air was cool and smelled faintly of recycled oxygen and the static of high-powered electronics. Below the black, bat-winged silhouettes of the stealth bombers, the world was a void of deep indigo, broken only by the distant, flickering lights of the rescue fleet 500 miles to the south. This was the final phase of the American response, a coordinated decapitation strike against the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Naval Command Center in Bandar Abbas. The B-2 Spirit bombers were effectively invisible to the Iranian early warning radars, their curved surfaces and radar-absorbent materials, scattering the electronic pulses into the empty sky. The pilots monitored their fuel states with a professional, quiet focus, having completed their third aerial refueling from a KC-46 Pegasus tanker over the Indian Ocean 4 hours earlier. Each bomber carried 16 GBU-31 Joint Direct Attack munitions, each weighing 2,000 pounds, and equipped with a hardened steel nose for penetrating reinforced concrete. The targeting data had been updated in real time via the Milstar satellite link, pinpointing the exact coordinates of the underground bunkers at 27 degrees 11 minutes north, 56 degrees 17 minutes east. The mission commander in the lead aircraft checked the weapons release window on his glass cockpit display. The internal bomb bay doors, long and jagged, cycled open with a heavy mechanical whine that was swallowed by the thin air at 50,000 feet. The trigger was squeezed. One by one, the massive 2,000-pound bombs detached from the rotary launchers, falling into the darkness with a silent, terrifying grace. The bombs deployed their GPS-guided fins, correcting their flight paths at twice the speed of sound as they dived toward the coastal city of Bandar Abbas. The first warhead punched straight through the 12-foot-thick, reinforced concrete roof of the primary command bunker, a facility designed to withstand a nuclear near-miss. The delay action fuse triggered 3 floors below ground, and the resulting detonation was a catastrophic release of energy that blew the heavy steel blast doors off their hinges. A fireball 500 feet wide erupted from the ventilation shafts, sending a pillar of pulverized concrete and flame into the night sky. The shockwave was so powerful, it cracked the foundations of the surrounding harbor buildings and shattered windows 5 miles away. Inside the facility, the Iranian command staff had less than a second to react before the pressure wave compressed the air in the hallways to the density of solid rock. Secondary explosions followed almost instantly as the main power generators and fuel storage tanks were ignited by the primary blast. The entire 5-story underground complex collapsed in a single, grinding groan of failing structural steel, burying the leadership of the regional naval forces under thousands of tons of debris. The defenders on the surface responded by firing hundreds of rounds of anti-aircraft artillery and shoulder-fired missiles blindly into the dark, their tracers lighting up the sky in a frantic, useless display of red and yellow light. The B-2 Spirit bombers did not linger to watch the destruction. The bomb bay doors closed, and the aircraft banked into a wide, slow turn toward the west, their thermal signatures shielded from the ground by their over-wing engine intakes. The sky behind them was a landscape of orange fire and black smoke, the city of Bandar Abbas plunging into darkness as the regional power grid failed. The command and control infrastructure that had authorized the strike on the USS Carl Vinson had been obliterated in less than 30 seconds of sustained violence. The silence returned to the high altitude, broken only by the low-frequency vibration of the bomber's engines as they began the long journey home. The strategic objective of the campaign had been achieved. The Iranian military's ability to coordinate large-scale naval or missile operations in the Gulf of Oman was effectively zero. The USS Gerald R. Ford, operating 300 miles to the south, confirmed the successful strike via its own passive sensors, noting the total cessation of organized Iranian radar activity along the coast. The environment over the target was now one of absolute ruin, the smell of burning diesel and pulverized stone drifting over the harbor on the evening breeze. As the B-2 Spirit bombers crossed back into international airspace, the pilots began their final mission reports. They had delivered 32 tons of high explosives with a margin of error measured in centimeters. The price for the attack on the American carrier had been paid in the heart of the Iranian military establishment. The night remained cold and dark at 50,000 feet, a quiet sanctuary for the stealth pilots who had just ended a war before the rest of the world had fully realized it had begun. 11:30 at night on the 12th of January, 2026, the Gulf of Oman. The USS Carl Vinson, after 16 hours of fighting the sea, finally lost its battle with gravity. The massive 90,000-ton hull, now tilted at a lethal 45-degree angle, gave a final, mournful groan as the internal air pockets exploded under the pressure of the deep. The night was pitch black, illuminated only by the searchlights of the surrounding destroyers and the faint, orange glow of burning fuel. Still floating on the surface of the water, there was no cheer, no radio chatter, only a heavy, absolute silence. As the flight deck vanished beneath the black waves at coordinates 24 degrees, 12 minutes north, 58 degrees, 30 minutes east, the sinking was a slow, vertical plunge, the bow of the ship rising momentarily toward the stars before the weight of the flooded engine rooms dragged the entire structure down into the 3,000-meter trench of the Arabian Sea. The environment was a graveyard of American naval history, the smell of the sea finally returning as the acrid smoke was smothered by the water. The vortex created by the sinking ship pulled down the remaining debris, leaving only a vast, shimmering oil slick, and thousands of floating white life vests as a reminder of where a city of steel had once stood. On the bridge of the USS Mason, every sailor stood at attention, a silent salute to the ship that had been their home, and the centerpiece of American power in the region for 4 decades. The final casualty report, compiled by the Joint Task Force at Al Udeid, was a sobering tally of the cost of the engagement. Out of the 5,422 personnel assigned to the USS Carl Vinson, 142 were confirmed killed in action. .312 sailors were listed as missing and presumed dead, most of them lost when the forward engineering compartments were crushed by the initial missile impact and subsequent flooding. 918 personnel were treated for injuries, ranging from severe thermal burns to compound fractures. The rescue operation, however, was classified as a monumental success. 4,050 survivors were successfully extracted from the water and moved to safety aboard the USS Gerald R and the requisitioned commercial tankers. The strategic assessment of the campaign revealed a permanent shift in the United States naval posture in the Middle East. While the loss of a Nimitz-class carrier was a significant blow to the inventory of the Navy, the technical data gathered by the Aegis combat system provided a critical understanding of the terminal maneuvers of the Emad ballistic missile. The Navy immediately authorized the fast-track deployment of 2 additional carrier strike groups, the USS Ronald Reagan and the USS Abraham Lincoln, to the North Arabian Sea. Future defensive protocols were rewritten to prioritize the saturation of the upper atmosphere with Standard Missile 3 and Standard Missile 6 interceptors. Whenever a carrier operated within 1,200 kilometers of a hostile coastline, the retaliatory strikes had been equally decisive in their results. Post-strike intelligence confirmed that 95% of the Iranian coastal defense infrastructure in the Hormuzgan province had been neutralized. The destruction of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Naval Command Center in Bandar Abbas had effectively paralyzed the enemy's chain of command, leading to a total cessation of hostilities within 24 hours of the B-2 Spirit bomber strikes. The Iranian surface fleet was confined to port, its crews unwilling to face the invisible threat of the F-35 Charlies now patrolling the sky. The gateway to the Persian Gulf remained open, though the price of that passage had been etched into the seabed in the form of a billion-dollar warship. The USS Gerald R. Ford remained on station for 30 days, its presence a defiant statement of American resilience. The flight deck, lit by 1,000 LED floodlights, was a constant hive of activity, as the F-35 and FA-18 fighters continued to maintain the exclusion zone. The survivors of the Vinson were slowly rotated back to the United States for medical leave and reassignment, their stories of courage and loss becoming the new foundation of naval tradition. The war had been short, violent, and technologically transformative, proving that while a single strike could kill a ship, it could not break the system that supported it. As the sun rose on the 13th of January, the Gulf of Oman looked as it always had a vast, blue expanse of trade and tension. But beneath the surface, the USS Carl Vinson rested in the dark, a silent monument to the day the rules of naval warfare changed forever. The United States Navy had proven it could absorb a mortal blow and strike back with a precision that bordered on the surgical. The mission was complete, the survivors were home, and the fleet moved on, its radar eyes always searching the horizon for the next shadow in the sky.